welcome everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our final session of the special series on God's call to creation care and environmental justice. My name is Emily Holmes. I'm happy to be back with you again this Sunday. So far, we've learned about scriptural and theological foundations of creation care. We've learned about environmental racism and environmental justice, and we've learned about food justice and food apartheid here in Memphis. So today we're going to conclude our series with a panel discussion on the topic of where do we grow from here, which is, I love that title. I can't take credit for it. That's clearly a reference to Dr. Martin Luther King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? So I'd like to thank the United Methodist Earth Keepers and the Green Seminary Initiative at Memphis Theological Seminary for sponsoring this series. And I want to welcome our panelists this morning. I'm going to briefly introduce each of them, and then we'll get into our discussion. So at the bottom of my screen, I'm not sure how it appears to y'all, but is Justin J. Pearson. He is the co-founder of Memphis Community Against the Pipeline. Justin graduated from Mitchell High School as valedictorian and then from Bowdoin College, majoring in government and legal studies and education. He currently lives in Memphis, but works for the headquarters of Year Up, which is in Boston, a national program helping 18 to 24-year-olds gain entry-level jobs with corporate partners. Justin is one of the leaders of Memphis Community Against the Pipeline, which is the Black-led environmental justice organization seeking to end racism and injustice in Memphis by stopping the Byhalia Connection pipeline. And I know we're going to hear more about that in our talk, in our panel this morning. Mia Madison is the executive director of Memphis Tilth and the Just Climate Champion as part of Memphis Just Change initiative through the Center for Transforming Communities. Mia serves foremost as an environmental advocate and community organizer throughout the Mid-South region. Her passions are urban agriculture, environmental justice, the green economy, equitable access to public lands and services, and community participation in urban affairs. She holds a master's degree in applied anthropology and a bachelor's degree in geography, both from the University of Memphis. Welcome, Mia. David Vaughn is the horticulturist at New Hope Christian Academy in Memphis, in Fraser, where for the last 8 years, he has helped transform an empty acre lot into a productive and educational and beautiful, I have to say, having seen an urban farm. David has a unique background in both edible and ornamental horticulture, which he fuses together in his work to create spaces that are sustainable, productive, and beautiful. David's career began in Senegal, West Africa, as an urban agricultural extension agent for the Peace Corps. There he worked with a wide variety of urban gardens to promote improved crop management and gardening practices. More than anything, David's work focuses on weaving beauty, creativity, and sustainability together to help promote connection to the natural world. So welcome to each and all of you. I'm so glad we're here together on this rainy, very warm, very humid Memphis morning. So I've got some questions to get us started for the panelists. And I want to just start by asking how each of you got into this work. You're each engaged in this really important work of caring for our environment here in Memphis in different ways. So how did you personally develop a passion for the work of creation care and environmental justice? And what beliefs or values motivate you in your work? And let's just start with Justin.
Well, first, thank you so much for this opportunity. You all are doing such extraordinary work, and I did some Googling of previous talks, and it's just really an honor to be here this morning. I got involved in this work in October, really in a serious way, so y'all got a lot more experience than me as it relates to, and I love those words, creation care. But what I learned about was this Byhalia Connection pipeline, which is a crude oil pipeline that is being sought to run from Oklahoma down to the Gulf. And it's going to run right through Southwest Memphis. And so predominantly Black community, which sits atop our aquifer, which is also atop one of the most seismically active earthquake zones in the Southeast. And the question you have to ask is, why would any company decide to do that? And we learned that, they're going to make $7 billion in revenue. And they called the community the point or path of least resistance. And so those words ignited what you would say is this movement that's developing now in South Memphis. And for me, where my folks are from in Westwood, and went to Mitchell High School, as you read earlier. This area and this community has a lot of value. And so when I think about climate justice, when I think about creation care, it is really starting with the people, right? And I reflect on that and I think about it often. I had was raised there. My grandmothers lived in 38109, and it wasn't really until we got active in this fight that it started to dawn on me. Both of them passed away from cancer. I have an uncle with a disease that they don't even know what it is, lived in Southwest Memphis his entire life. And so there's something that's happening. I have an uncle with a type of asthma that he's had to have surgery for, right? There's something in the air, quite literally. And because everybody is somewhere and everybody is somebody, the environment that they're in really matters. And so the beliefs, I would say, that are guiding our movement and our work is first, the Creator created us as people, and there's an obligation to care for one another. And in this struggle in particular, we believe that we have a responsibility to care for those who have been most disenfranchised. The Jesus that we talk about is Black, is the son of a teenage mother, grew up impoverished, and as a refugee from a system that would eventually lynch him. And so, if that is the person we identify with, then the people who are most oppressed down in this city, in South Memphis or North Memphis and other places, we have an obligation to be with them in this moment. And as a city, we are rising, and it's quite beautiful to watch and to be a part of, because together we're going to stop this pipeline.
Thank you, Justin. I love that theological perspective. Thank you so much for sharing that. Mia, why don't you go next?
That's going to be hard to follow. Well, and good morning, everyone. And thank you, Emily. And thank you to the Memphis Theological Seminary for allowing me to speak today. As I look across the panel and my esteemed colleagues, how, when I think about how I got into this work, it was purely personal, and some of that was what Justin may have alluded to. When I first started to think about environmental justice and what that really meant to community, I was researching groundwater contamination in North Memphis because my grandmother had been diagnosed with cancer. And not only her, but my great grandmother was diagnosed with cancer, and they lived on the same street. And so I had found an article that led to that led me further and further into research to figure out what was happening in the North Memphis community along the Wolf River. And that's how I learned about the Valero contamination and what that really meant to populations and communities along the Wolf River. And so that just kind of sent my mind spiraling. And I had already grown up in a garden with my grandparents who were sharecroppers and migrated to Memphis in the early 50s and started to grow with and in community, for community, with family. And so I always had a passion for the earth. I was the kid that, Mom, that squirrel, you've got to break. and so when I first learned about community gardens in Memphis was through Grow Memphis. And so I volunteered with Josephine Alexander, who now runs Tubby Creek Farms. And she taught me a lot about community gardens. And I launched my first community garden in the North Memphis area, the 7th Street Community Garden, which I affectionately named Mbutu. And so that work, that work kind of led me to do other things. At the University of Memphis studying geography, quality of life was a passion of mine. And so when I looked at social vulnerability and what communities were susceptible to, I learned so much about urban contamination and what that really meant and why environmental justice was important. In learning about the Memphis Depot and learning about Cancer Alley and understanding how one person could create community and create and become an advocate in a way that would allow community change. And so, excuse me, further on in my career, as I became the executive director of Memphis Tilth, the mission statement of the organization really resonated with me: to cultivate collective action for an economically sustainable, socially equitable, environmentally sound local food system. Well, everyone needs food, and you've got to have good soil in order to have food. And so, as a soil advocate, I started looking at the contamination of the soil in and around North Memphis and started to think of ways with colleagues that we could remediate that soil. So we started looking at how mycorrhizal and mycelium could be used as an extraction technique for contaminants in the soil. And so we'll talk more about that, I guess, throughout this talk today. But that's really what led me to be in community with others, to understand how the earth was impacting their environment. What did it really mean, quality of life? And how could we together then change the outcomes for a community that would give us healthy, that would make us healthy, and through the creation of food doing that?
Thank you, Mia. David, how'd you get into this work?
Yeah. It's first of all, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I got into this line of work kind of in a bizarre way. I was a sociology major in college and was kind of headed down a social work track of some sort, but wanted to be abroad, wanted to get out of the bubble of the US. And so I went to Senegal with the Peace Corps, and just so happened to have enough volunteer experience in gardening to be placed as an urban agriculture extension agent, which is a glorified way of saying I was helping basic community gardens in and around urban areas in Senegal, specifically Dakar. And so as a part of that, I was working specifically with a psychiatric ward garden in the city, and basically, and that was one of many gardens I was working on, but that one kind of became my baby. And I was able to kind of slowly transform kind of an abandoned space behind the psychiatric ward. And it turned into kind of a therapy garden. A lot of the patients would come out, a lot of their family members would come out. The ward itself was very barren. And so it just became a kind of a little refuge, not only for them, but also for me as somebody who was experiencing a lot of change, just being in a whole new country with a language that I was struggling to understand. That garden kind of transformed me. And I think from that specific garden experience, I kind of learned how much, how impactful it can be to be in a green space, and how important beauty is, and how impactful those can be. And then also that I just absolutely love working with my hands, and I loved the kind of work. And so from there, that led me to a career in horticulture. And so I've been, ever since I came back to the United States, have been working in this field, and specifically with New Hope Christian Academy, working with an acre lot that is not only productive and beautiful, but also kind of a whimsical place for the students of New Hope, which is an elementary school, to come and engage with. So through that, so New Hope is in Fraser, and so it's been really incredible to see students from the Raleigh and Fraser area specifically be able to engage with a space that is just very different than the green spaces around where they're living. And so I think, and that's something we'll get into later on in the talk, but I think that, when we talk about environmental justice, I think starting with kids and being able to expose our students and children to green spaces and to growing things and to really have them immersed in beauty, I think is something that is extremely important. So but we can get into that as we go on.
Great, thank you. And I think each of you have just kind of touched on my next question a little bit, but maybe we can go a bit deeper. Because I wanted to ask, we sometimes think of environmental problems like pollution or climate change as a separate issue from food justice concerns, where we think about things like feeding the hungry and food access. And one of the things this series has asked us to do is to think about these issues together in conjunction. And so I wanted to ask you, where do you see connections between the environment and our food or water system? And how does thinking about that intersection between environment, food, water, people, how does that help us to understand the root of the problems and to address them more effectively? And this time, Mia, why don't we start with you? You're muted. You're muted. Sorry.
Sorry, I just was moving things over so I could see the question and make sure that I'm answering it entirely. And so when I think about food justice and the climate and the environment and how that is all interconnected, I see food as an extension of the environment. And I see it, it's very important to me that, as I said, we start with good soil. And so when soil is identified in a way in which that we immediately think in Memphis that soil is not good. This is something that I hear all the time. Soil is not a good place to grow food in Memphis. And so it concerns me from a food justice perspective, because that means that many people will not even attempt to grow their own food. And so that's really very important in communities that are food deserts. So when there isn't an opportunity or a mindset to grow food, or even to understand what soil contamination in communities could look like, it really exacerbates the poverty issue, or continues the food desert space in those areas. So water is a source of life. Water, if contaminated, even in bad soil, or in good soil, can further contaminate soil to push out contaminated food. And so when I think about the environment and food and water and people, all of those things have to be healthy, and it starts with good soil. That's what Tilth means, right? Good soil. And that's why I'm so passionate about Memphis Tilth as an organization. I don't see pollution or climate change as a separate issue from food justice concerns. I feel like that it's the same, because when you start in a good place, you can end in a good place. And in the end, in that good place is healthy people, right? And so to me, and I'm happy to come back around to this, but I'd love to give other people an opportunity and maybe make it a conversation, because I come from a built environment, urban planning background. So I worked for the city of Memphis Housing and Community Development for a number of years. And so part of the work that we would look at is identifying spaces in which communities could grow, and community gardens and public green spaces were one of those spaces where we talked about reforestation, where we talked about, the expansion of agricultural lands. And every time the barrier to that was either access to land or contamination. And so I feel like when we address soil in a meaningful way and make it healthy for community, if not to grow land, but just for a community to have safe soil in their communities, to remove lead, to remove PCBs, to think about what groundwater contamination looks like, I feel like we'll have a more healthy people.
Great. Thank you, Mia. David, how do you see these interconnections between environment and food access issues?
Yeah, I mean, to piggyback on what Mia was saying, I think, when we think about climate change, as somebody who's a grower and who's grown vegetables and edibles for a long time, I think it's really important to understand that as the climate changes, what ends up happening is you have these weather extremes, and it's not only happening here, as we saw last week with hitting record low temperatures. It's happening all over the country and all over the world. And so what this means for large scale agriculture is that you're going to have more drought. You're going to have more extreme weather events that wipe out places where we grow food, but you're also going to have more insect issues. So, if you're not familiar with growing vegetables, I mean, insects are a huge problem. And if you're growing organically, it can be extremely difficult to keep up. And so all of these things make it not only harder to grow food, but it makes it harder to give that better access for communities that are located in food deserts. And so all of this kind of weaves into, it's kind of a terrible cycle. So as the climate continues to change, we're going to see more issues with food security. And I think that it's really important to recognize that and to not think that they're totally different issues.
Thank you. Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, one, it's so beautiful. Mia and David, you're so good. Just hitting all the points, and I love this. My vocabulary is expanding quite significantly in this conversation. What you mentioned, the intersection of all of these are so important, right? If you ever try and look at something in isolation, you're missing the whole point. And I would say just a few things. One is undergirding food injustice and insecurity is a problem in our society in two ways, and one is racial, right? We have determined that the worth of people of color and Black people in particular is less significant than people who have means and who are wealthy and who are white. And so there's no looking at the roots, no pun intended, without paying attention to America's long history of racial injustice. And you have to look at the way that our current economic system is formed too, because it is creating food deserts, right? That those aren't accidents or just incidents that are happening. We have an economic system that is saying that certain people will have certain levels of income, they will have certain types of jobs, and they will be excluded intentionally from access to the resources that people like David and Mia are actually putting back inside of these communities, right? So when you mentioned the kids in Fraser or people in North Memphis, right, that is subversive to the norm, right? Like having a garden in New Chicago, for instance, right? Like you're like, wow, that's amazing. But if you were having it in the suburbs, it'd be like, well, yeah, that's kind of what those folks do. And so who suffers, right? And how is that suffering or that lack of access linked to this much broader, much deeper, much more problematic history of a racist form of capitalism and a society rooted in racism? And if we start calling these things out and speaking them out, we can start to see how these intersections really can be recognized, and then we can actively do work of dismantling them. Because there's something about what David's doing and what Mia's doing, and even this conversation, what it is doing that is subversive to our current culture, and thus it is anti-racist in its act, right? But we have to call it out that some people in our community of Memphis don't have enough money to purchase certain goods. We have to start saying that there are certain people who are being excluded from the opportunities that being a grower of their own food would provide, because they're working 80 hours a week just trying to make ends meet. And so what they purchase at McDonald's is just going to fit. Right. And the privilege that some of us have to think about environmental justice and to think about climate justice and to think about water justice as a collective body is a privilege. And what is the responsibility of people like us, in my opinion, is to say, if you've got the time, the energy, and the ability to think about these issues, and you have that type of social location, then use that privilege and that opportunity for people who have a different social location where they don't have that time or that opportunity or that space. Okay, and so those are sort of two big ideas, and then I'll get a little more clear with the problem we're facing. This pipeline company called this community the path of least resistance because it has been disinvested in for decades. Okay, it's been disinvested in politically, socially, economically, and environmentally. That is how we got the oil refinery, and we got the steel mill, and we got all the other industries with it. 17 toxic release inventory facilities are in Southwest Memphis, 4 times the cancer rate than anywhere else in this country. Right, like that's not accidental. It was that those people, as Mustafa Santiago Ali said we created a sacrifice zone, and now that community is still being sacrificed by a crude oil pipeline company running through folks' land and their property. But here's the risk to Memphis. They're building the pipeline on top of the Memphis sand aquifer. Okay, this is where we get our water. We just experienced what it was like to have to try and boil water. We can't boil crude oil out of water. Sorry about that. But this is what we're risking for their profit, our actual drinking water, in an area where we know there's going to be an earthquake. But if we accept or adopt a mentality that some people have more worth, that some people deserve to have the ability to grow their own food, or some people deserve to have the ability to teach their kids what that means to be a grower, and that we don't start to see that value and that worth in every person, in every plot of soil. I love what Mia said. It's like, we got good soil, right? If we start to retrain the way that we are thinking, hopefully we start to rethink how we think about one another, because this is ultimately the problem. We're not seeing value in the Black and brown and lower income and lower wealth people in our city and in our country. Let's be quite frank, because these systems of capitalism have said, nope, these folks are going to be good and these folks are going to be in need, and we'll run over the people who are in need because no one will care for them. And I'm guilty of this, right? I haven't loved 38109 in South Memphis like I oughta, right? Like I'm guilty of not investing enough time there. And we collectively have to do an act of repentance, which is to say, not only does the soil and the water have value, but the people have value. And because of that, we're going to do some work in those communities in a more intentional way that get them information and education so they can then activate their communities and grow their own food and protect the water as a community. We do that work. And once we start to benefit, what do you say in scripture? The last, the lost, and the least, everybody will benefit.
I love that. Thank you so much. Yeah, we all have to be intersectional thinkers. We have to think about our own social location, our privilege, and we also have to see value and abundance and potential rather than scarcity in community. So I think this brings us right to my next question, which is, for each of you, what are the most pressing issues in Memphis right now in relation to environmental justice or food justice? And Justin's already identified one. How were these problems created by the history of racial injustice in our city? And in what ways do they disproportionately impact communities of color today? And David, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pipeline has to be number one right now. It's the most pressing issue, and the work that you're doing, Justin, is so important. And I mean, the irony is that with it being over the aquifer, it affects everyone. So but obviously disproportionately in the communities in South Memphis. But I would say on top of that, the issue of food security in the city is huge. And having worked in Fraser the last 8 years, it's really sad to see that historically Black neighborhoods have had less access to locally grown organic food. So number one. Number two, working with students in these communities, the places in which a lot of the students live are apartments and areas that don't have access to green spaces that are safe and beautiful. And I think that's a huge part of something that I've noticed over the years, and something that I think is extremely important, is not only access to food, but also access to spaces that are safe, green, and beautiful, because it works wonders for the soul. I think all of us can agree that nature is rejuvenating, and as someone who grew up wandering outside for hours upon hours of the day exploring ants with a microscope, and just like what that does for a kid's imagination, what it does for it opens their eyes to so much, and I think that is being lost in a lot of places, and I think it kind of goes back to what Justin said. If the kids in areas in the suburbs, I think would generally be expected to have more access to those safe and beautiful green spaces. And so there are issues of race that come with that. There are issues, especially of poverty in these certain neighborhoods. And I think for food, it is so important to think about, especially when you think about organic food. The areas, even if you look at where the farmers markets are located, they're located in areas that are usually generally more white, and have the access to those are going to be white people as opposed to African Americans. And so I think that is another huge issue, and I think that's something that we've learned and are trying to work towards in Fraser, and I know Mia's all over the city. And so I think for me, those are on top of the pipeline. Those are some of the bigger issues that we're facing.
Thank you. Justin, do you want to say a little bit more about the pipeline or any other issues that you think are most pressing today?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm telling you, I continue to learn a lot about how strong the environmental justice community here in Memphis is, and they've been extraordinary supporters of the work that we're doing because have already had a predisposition to how important water is and how important soil is, and so I'm grateful to this community. When I think about this pipeline and pumping 1,500 psi of crude oil through literally our soil, and I hear the statistics. Big report done said 1 pound of crude oil will contaminate 25 million gallons of water, and hundreds of thousands of gallons would spew out of just a small crack in this pipeline. Right, we're up against so many systems, and we have to realize that we can win, but the only thing that stops one corporation or two corporations like Valero, Plains All American with this Bahia Connection pipeline from running over communities will be people power. It will be realizing that if you are not directly affected, you are indirectly affected, and realizing that we have inherited this treasure of an aquifer that we had no responsibility in creating. And we have a wonderful opportunity to pass that on to future generations without a crude oil pipeline, particularly as the economy shifts away and all those other things. And I do want to say, like, this community, this neighborhood where I'm from, right? Like, it was built, right? Like, we built Memphis this way. We built it so certain people would live in certain communities where there were green spaces, and certain folks would have an educational system that benefited them and others would not. Right? And it is important to realize that and reflect on that reality, that none of this is haphazard, because you also gain an appreciation. I personally gain an appreciation for the work that y'all are doing because you're moving a boulder uphill, right? Because the hill was built by inequality. It was built by injustice. It was built by poverty. It was built by educational inopportunity. And so it's a lot of work to try and resist that. And it is much easier to push the boulder if you've got, 10,000 folks with you. And so that's what movement building is really about. And it is recognizing that intersection, that they're willing to risk our water and they're willing to risk our people's land because they think it's just an individual effort. But if communities begin to rise up and say, you know what, we're not going to do another farmers market unless it's in 38109 or unless we're partnering with Mia. No more companies are coming into our neighborhood and risking our aquifer anymore. We're going to make sure our city council does right and prioritizes environmental justice. Right? We have to start speaking differently and from the lens of justice, because ultimately, like, that's what gets us all free. And I say this in every opportunity that I get, that like no one in this country has ever been free. No one. It's like if you've been enslaving people, you're not free. And as long as my uncle and my brothers like are breathing toxins from oil refineries, just because you're a few miles down, like you're not free either. And so if we're going to get free, we have to say, oh, this pipeline has to stop, right? Because we care about those people and we care about that water and we care about the future that we could create. And when we start to think in that more collective mindset, we really have a real opportunity for transformation. Mia, what you think?
I was just saying, yes, I had my notes for so food sovereignty, right? Food sovereignty. So you can't even understand freedom until you have food sovereignty. And so food sovereignty meaning growing your own food. Growing your own food is the most revolutionary thing you can do as an American, specifically as a Black American, right? To understand that you don't have to depend on someone else for your subsistence explains to you that you have everything within you. God has given everything to you, available to you, for you to be able to be regenerative of this earth. To be able to regenerate the earth means that you understand what the environment means to life. And so when you say that there's this hill that's been built on with nothing but systemic racism, I say to that, plant in the hill. The hill is made of soil. And so that's how we prove regeneration. And we've got to demonstrate how resiliency starts in the soil, right? That's why I'm a soil advocate. Everything that we are from the soil. We are the dust that comes yes, plant in the hill. So when you were speaking, I was like, Sunday morning Bible study. Let me write this down. So, I say to that, yes. Inside the soil, there may not necessarily be all of the nutrients that you need in the soil, but you can put those back in with things from agriculture. David knows this. We build soil. We do companion planting. We look at carbon and we figure out what other organic matter do we need to marry with that. And so when we look at organizations that build soil like Compost Fairy, right? I was just at their site the other day, which is right next to TVA. And I was thinking to myself how revolutionary this is to be able to generate good, clean, healthy soil right next to a coal plant. This is something that everybody ought to be able to see. And TVA should be looking down at that soil being generated saying, how can I help them? How can I help them build more soil so they can disperse it out into communities? And so when I think about food access and when I think about food access, I think about it from a holistic standpoint. A lot of people in Memphis don't have access to food because access for people look a lot. Access looks differently for people regardless of the community that you're in. So when I was doing planning and we were looking at communities like North Haven and we were looking at communities like even in Collierville, North Haven is cut off from the rest of the city, but it is a part of Shelby County. At one point, there was a bus system that went into North Haven, but now it doesn't. Go into that community. It's been cut off from the system. So when we think about food generation in that community, there isn't any really. There is a store there, but it's not immediately accessed. There's no Kroger in that community. Walmart neighborhood market is not looking to move into North Haven. So when we think about food generation or growing food in a community like North Haven, that to me would be environmental justice. When we think about pockets of poverty in Collierville, most people say, oh, they don't need anything, they have access. Collierville and Germantown are seemingly to be thought of the more wealthier parts of Shelby County, but there are people in those communities, especially seniors. There are Black people who live in these communities, and many may not know, and time has changed the community of Collierville that started as a Black tent city out of slavery, that turned into one of the more wealthier parts of Shelby County. When we look into those communities and see that there are many people who don't have access to fresh local food. Access to food is one thing, having transportation, getting to a store, being able to do that. But when you've come through COVID and lost your job and you don't have gasoline to get to the grocery store, or the car's broken down, or when I look at youth who depend on parents who many times in suburbs are not home because they are out working to make sure that the lifestyle that they're trying to create for that child, it can be maintained. Those children many times don't have the access that they need to be able to get to the things that are necessary for their holistic development. And food is one of those things. Children ought to be able to walk outside and pick something off of a tree. That's why we do our Give and Growth orcharding program, so that we can see fruit, berries, and nuts dispersed in communities where you can see what you plant and pick and eat and have nutrition. I'm rambling now, Emily. I'm sorry. But Justin got me going when he was like, it's a hill. No, we got a plant in the hill. It's dirt too. Well, excuse me. It may start as dirt, but we've got to make it a healthy soil.
I love it. This is so inspiring, y'all. And we've got a number of questions in the Q&A, and I do want to invite our audience, if you think of questions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll turn to those audience questions. And this is about the role of faith communities. What do you think is the role of faith communities? What should it be in addressing problems of environmental or food justice? How can communities of faith get involved with your work? How can they use their resources? What's the best way to create the most impact? And David, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, this is something that I've thought a lot about, and I think I would start with, and this is, I would start with the way that each person interacts with and views the natural world. I think you start there because right now, I think in the world that we live in, I think it's very easy to not notice the beauty all around us in the natural world. And I think if you start there, then you start to quickly realize how much is changing, how fast it's changing, and how necessary it is to take steps in your own life. So I think on an individual level, that's where I'd start, is just taking the time to notice and appreciate the natural world. And even though Memphis is terribly humid and in the summer and can be brutal, there's so much life all around us that is so inspiring. And I think if you start there, and faith really plays a role in that. I mean, I think for me, when I'm out in the farm, even if it's in the summer and I'm sweating and I have my fourth shirt on, it's my sanctuary. It's where I notice and appreciate and see God and everything. But I also think that churches have a really unique role in that. I think about my childhood growing up, and I think about how important the youth group was, the Sunday school, and all of these kind of church child communities that are created in churches. And I think that we have to do a better job in general of weaving in the importance of nature into those kind of scenarios and classes. I think for children to have that exposure, because especially with the way that technology is, as we all know, kind of transforming even in my lifetime, I think it's so necessary for kids to have better access and more kind of have more time and have that be more part of the discussion in churches, not only using Bible verses, but also just getting kids outside and getting them outside together and outside in safe spaces to enjoy and appreciate nature. But on a kind of a larger scale, I think that, and Mia, I'm sure would agree with this, there are so many volunteer opportunities for gardens. I think, for not only New Hope, but all the gardens around the city, it's always hard to find volunteers who are willing to work hard. And I think it's really necessary to support this work, not only being advocates, but also, if possible, coming out and giving a Saturday or giving time to get your hands dirty, because I think that the process and experience of getting your hands dirty and actually participating in the work helps you develop a love for it, and also realize how hard it is. I mean, it's hard growing food, and the more that you participate in that process, the more that you learn about it, and the more that you're able to understand what goes into it, and it kind of it's a ripple effect. It all ripples out. And so I think, starting from a very solo perspective, starting with noticing, and then going from education to hands-on experience. I think all of those are really important.
That's great. Thank you. Justin, how can communities of faith, congregations support your work?
Yeah, well, go to memphiscap.org, memphiscap.org. Join us, fill out that form, leave a message, tell folks we met here. And that's one thing you do. You can sign the petition, you can do the public sign-on letter, because this is, and I tell folks it's the pipeline now, but we'll be fighting poverty soon after, in a very intentional way. And just this conversation, I've learned a lot about how you can combat that. And so my thing's right from a biblical perspective. So you got Adam and Eve, right? They're in a garden. Okay, so they're like the first growers we got. And so preach a sermon about the environment. And raise people's consciousness so that there isn't just this perception, particularly within my own community, right? There's this perception that it is a lot of, white people with peace signs who care about the environment, right? Like this is the unfortunate trope that we've gotten and we've held on to. And I imagine it was pushed that way for certain reasons. When we know the folks who are going to be most impacted are going to be people of color, indigenous communities, and low wealth people. And to what Mia said, right, these pockets of poverty are existing in every community. And so preach about the environment, and our responsibility to care for it, and also the fact that we're a part of it. And then I would look to people like Mia and David, who have experience in this work, to get more proximate. And I think there is a people proximity problem when it comes to nature. And I can say I'm guilty of this too. And so I'm fortunate for this opportunity, because it is important that we get more proximate, literally, with our very presence and with our hands, into the work of growing, into the work of maintaining. When I went to college, my trip before college started was on a farm. And David's right, quick deviation. Went outside, it was like 10 o'clock at night, and you look up, right? And it's on a farm, it's in Maine. And it was just the whole galaxy, I swear. It was just like up there. And I was like, what is happening? And so I got my sleeping bag and I slept outside, because I was like, yep, this is God. There God is. This is where I'm supposed to be. Y'all can go inside, but like, this is it. And so something about being proximate there is helpful. And so getting closer to that. And then I think the old proverb, pray, then move your feet, right? This is active work happening now to protect our water, to protect our environment and our futures. And there's always a lot of room on the sidelines, but there's a lot of room, in the field, on the court too. And we need as many people to leave the sidelines and say, Nope, I'm going to write this letter. Nope, I'm going to talk and have this conversation, or financially, I'm going to support this organization, because we need people to keep praying, keep preaching, and then act.
Great, thank you. Mia, how can communities of faith support your work? You're muted.
I keep doing that. So I was lucky enough to come into Memphis Tilth as the second tenure of leadership. Initially, Memphis Tilth was launched by 5 different organizations coming together. Grow Memphis, Bring It Food Hub, the Center for Food and Faith, Urban Farms, and the Food Advocacy Council. And so as I've learned the Center for Food and Faith, and I could be wrong, and Emily, you may have a little more information about this, but what I understand that to be is a relationship between churches and communities in creating an access to fresh local food. And so when I think about ways in which churches or communities of faith can partner in getting access to fresh local food, I look at Bring It Food Hub, and I looked at that particular program of Memphis Tilth as being one where we can create drop sites at churches where parishioners and community members that surround that church can come there and get a bag of fresh local vegetables. That supports local food, that supports the local farmer. There are lands that churches and communities of faith have access to. Devote those lands to food production. Utilize resources that you have access to be able to convert those lands into ones that can produce enough food, if not for the entire city, right? You can just focus on the community around you and the community that you're involved in, the people who are attending your spaces. And so when we think about something that David said, or excuse me, it may have been Justin, I apologize. But faith without works is dead, right? Faith without works is dead. And if we don't work on the issue of creating access to fresh, healthy food by way of clean, healthy soil, we have not only missed the mark in what it is that we are to regenerate in this life, right? To be regenerative ourselves, to regenerate the mind space. It says good old James is alive and well. I apologize. I'm not sure if I understand that particular reference, but it just makes me believe that I'm going in the right direction, because Memphis Tilth has what I like to call all the saints. James, wow. So my little brother's name was James, and a growing space that we just put at the Chelsea Avenue Farmers Market is called St. James. And so to me, in North Memphis at Chelsea and Springdale, faith without works is dead. And so I appreciate the reference, Jack. I really do, because that speaks wholeheartedly to where we're going with Memphis Tilth. It makes a difference to see in community spaces that grow. We are no longer waiting on grocery stores to move into communities. We are now creating growing spaces and developing market space alongside those, so that communities can have that access to food. And we would love to partner with churches on that. We would love to have churches organize parishioners as volunteers to work on sites where we can get more food in production. Those are real things. And we want to see that turn into economic opportunities for communities. We see we see other communities around the country who can turn church lands into profitable entrepreneur opportunities for youth who are in those churches. You can become a farmer. Youth have access to millions of dollars through the USDA, and they don't even know it because they don't understand that to become a farmer today really means to become a caretaker of the earth. They may think about it in a way in which in the past may have been too much labor. Oh, it's too hot. Oh, that's what my ancestors were forced to do that. So that's not something that I ever want to do. But you know what? To do those things, to do those things in community with others, it is healthy for the mind, and it is healthy for the spirit. It is healthy for the body. I'm telling you, I lost 65 pounds over the last year in community, in gardens, creating food with people, and I felt the best I've felt in a number of years. And so when I think about ways in which that churches and those who are interested in environment and those who are interested in creation care, those are some of the things that I immediately think of. But please feel free to reach out to Memphis Tilth. We are www.memphistilth.org. I'm happy to be in community with anyone who would like to take or embark upon this. There is a Black Clergy of Memphis organization that is now looking at ways in which to put either grocery stores or some type of market opportunity in communities so that they can have fresh access to food. I would encourage you to get involved with them and support what they're trying to do. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to put my email in the chat. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you all. We're getting close to the end of our time together. I think we've got 3 minutes left, and we've got a number of questions in the Q&A. And I think you've touched on many of these in your answers, but there are a couple questions about soil and concerns about soil in Memphis or in other places, and how do you do soil tests? Mia, can you just real quick address that question?
Your question was about soil tests? I apologize, I was reading the chat. So if you're interested in doing a soil test in your community, what I would encourage you to do is reach out to Memphis Tilth. We're happy to walk you through the process and give you the information. Once the soil is taken from the site, you can mail that to the University of Tennessee Extension Office. You can send that off to Nashville. But what I use is a local company called Waypoint Analytical. So the UT Extension, and you can use the Shelby County Extension Office. Dr. Cooper is a great resource over there. He'd be happy to walk you through mailing that off, and it's $15. At Waypoint Analytical, it's $16.50. You can walk it into the office, but some additional tests kind of go along with that. For $16.50, you get a fertility test. For an additional $3.50, you can understand your nitrogen content. I always encourage and do so on the sites that we grow on, a heavy metals test. Now that's $150, but I would encourage if that's something that you're interested in understanding the soil makeup of a particular area in your community, maybe a collection can be gathered in order for someone to reach or to get that heavy metals test done. But we look at somewhere around $170 per site to make sure that we're not further spreading contamination into food as it is further spreading contamination into food as it's grown on a particular site. But in some areas, you may not necessarily need that heavy metals testing, but definitely in an urban environment. And Emily, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think that's great. For the rest of the questions, we're probably not going to have time to answer them live. I'm just going to lift them up. There was a question about refugees and how immigration is caused by climate change, migration, and so thinking through that lens and that intersection with the questions we've been discussing. There's a question about how your spirituality has guided each of you, and I think you all addressed that in different ways. There's also a question about white privilege and how white people should spend their inherited privilege to help with these issues. And we've got a question about churches' involvement, which I think you all answered. And last question about using garden plots in a retirement community to grow food that could be donated. And so I'm going to let people follow up with each of you individually, if you don't mind dropping your email address in the chat if you're open to that and willing to answer questions. And then we're going to conclude. Martha Lyle Ford has joined us to tell us a little bit about what she's doing. So welcome, Martha Lyle.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Emily, Mia, David, Justin. This has just been an extraordinary morning. Thank you so much. And really an extraordinary series. This is the fourth and final session of this Sunday morning seminary, God's Call to Care for Creation and Environmental Justice. I really feel like though this is the last session, we're really just getting started. And that's kind of where I want to leave things. This series has been sponsored by a grant, excuse me, by the United Methodist Church's Earth Keepers program, and hosted by the Green Seminary Initiative at the seminary. We are very, very eager to be engaged with these organizations and folks represented here and others throughout the community, churches, congregations, individuals, to continue and build on this conversation and this work. I'm not going to do the advertisement stuff for MTS. We do have a great DMIN program, Land, Food, and Faith Formation. I'm going to encourage you to visit the websites of all of these organizations. You will be receiving a follow-up email that will include a short evaluation. Please, please, please fill that out and return it. And it will also include an opportunity to indicate if you particularly or you think your congregation or institution would be interested in continuing to be in this conversation. There is so much good work to be done, and now's the time. And we at Memphis Seminary are really, really eager to be active in the work and in helping advance the work. Excuse me. Again, my deep appreciation. I speak on behalf of the Green Seminary Initiative and Memphis Theological Seminary. Thank you all so much. Thanks for the work you're doing. Thanks for being part of this conversation. We hold you in our prayers and are here ready to help in whatever ways we can. So, and to you all who have joined us over the weeks and this morning, thanks for being part of this. And like I said, this is not the last session. We're just getting started. So thanks very much. Go in peace, blessings, go in peace, go in power, and be well. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. This is a very rich discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You guys have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.